Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Majors and Quinn Facebook page and YouTube channel. My name is Annie. I am the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which, if you're not familiar with us, is an independent bookstore based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If this is your first virtual event with us, welcome. If it's not your first, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us for these virtual author talks that we've been doing. It's been great fun to get to speak with authors from all over the world virtually. But today we are actually featuring a locally based author and her new book, The End of Bias, A Beginning. So we're very pleased to have Jessica Nordell here in the studio to talk about that tonight. And we're also very glad to have her conversation partner be Jenny Odell, another wonderful author. I'm going to introduce the two of them, and then we'll get this show on the road. But I do just want to mention a couple things. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of The End of Bias, we do have copies at Majors and Quinn. I will put the phone number for the bookstore into the chat. Give us a call, and we have signed copies currently at Majors and Quinn. Jessica stopped by and signed, so if you act fast, you may get a signed copy. And we do ship anywhere, so if you're watching from afar, we ship pretty much everywhere, including internationally, but we also do have next day curbside pickup as well if you want to go that route. And you can also stop by. We're open 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. And again, we are in uptown Minneapolis, Minnesota. And then also, we are going to have some time for question and answer with Jessica and Jenny at the end of the hour. So if you have any questions, please use the live chat function of this YouTube video to ask them. You can ask them at any point during the broadcast, but we will be getting to the questions, as many as we can, towards the end of the hour. You can also just use the chat to say hello, tell us where you're watching from. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you tuning in. And for anyone who is not able to tune in live, who was maybe planning to, maybe someone else in your friends or family, just know that this video remains available on the Majors and Quinn YouTube channel after tonight. So anyone can tune in after today. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. Jessica Nordell is a science and culture journalist whose writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The New Republic, and many others. A former writer for the public radio and producer for American Public Media, she graduated from Harvard University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and The End of Bias, A Beginning is her first book. Welcome, Jessica, and congratulations on the book. And then as her interviewer tonight, we have Jenny Odell, who's an artist and writer who teaches at Stanford, has been an artist in residence at places like San Francisco Dump, Facebook, the Internet Archive, and the San Francisco Planning Department, and has exhibited her art all over the world. She is the author of the book How to Do Nothing, and she lives in Oakland. Jessica and Jenny, thank you again for being here, and I will be back later for Q&A.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hey. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Should we start off? Did you want to start off with a reading?
Yeah, I thought maybe I'd just read like a page and a half just to kind of give people a flavor of the book if they haven't read it already, which they probably haven't because it was just published today. So I'm just going to read. I'll just read the first few paragraphs and then we can start chatting. This is from the introduction. Years after his cancer treatment, Ben Barris recalled how he'd phrased the request to his oncologist. "While you're removing my breast," he'd asked, "could you please take off the other one?" Cancer ran in the family, so the doctor agreed. But the truth is, Barris just wanted the breasts gone. Christened with a girl's name and raised as a girl, he'd never been at ease with that identity. Not as a 4-year-old, feeling he was a boy. Not as a teenager, uncomfortable with the changes of puberty. Not as an adult, squeezed into heels and a bridesmaid dress. This was 1995. It was before Laverne Cox and Caitlyn Jenner were household names. Before a Google search for transgender provided legal advice. Before Google. Barris didn't understand what being trans was. But the double mastectomy was an enormous relief. A year later, he read an article about a trans man, and the lights came on. Barris was eager to begin hormone treatment, but he had a major concern, his career. At 43, he was working as a neurobiologist at Stanford and had recently made a groundbreaking discovery about the significance of the glia, brain cells whose role had been previously underestimated. Others in the scientific community had always perceived him as a woman. He had no idea how they would respond to this change. Would students stop wanting to join the Barris lab? Would invitations to conferences disappear? The scientific community did react, but not in the ways Barris had feared. After his transition, people who did not know he was transgender started listening to Ben more carefully. They stopped questioning Ben's authority. Ben, middle-aged, white, and male, was no longer interrupted in meetings. He was, again and again, given the benefit of the doubt. He even received better service while shopping. At one conference, a scientist who didn't know Ben was transgender was overheard saying, "Ben gave a great seminar today, but then his work is so much better than his sister's." Barris was astonished. Before his transition, he had rarely detected sexism. Even overt examples hadn't registered. Once, when Barris was an undergraduate at MIT and the only person in a math class to solve a hard problem, the professor said, "Your boyfriend must have solved it for you." Barris was offended. He had solved it himself, of course. He didn't even have a boyfriend. But he didn't think of the comment as discriminatory because he thought sexism had ended. And even if it hadn't, he didn't identify enough as a woman to think sexism could apply to him. He was just furious to have been accused of cheating. Pre-transition, Barris assumed he had been treated like everyone else. Now he had stunning evidence to the contrary. It was almost a scientific experiment. He had the same education, same skills, same achievements, same capacity. All the variables had been held constant except one. Barris saw with searing clarity that his daily encounters, his scientific career, his life had all been shaped by the gender others saw in ways that had been invisible even to him. Before transitioning, his ideas, contributions, and authority had all been devalued, not overtly generally, but in a way that was noticeable when that devaluing suddenly vanished. Now the differences in the ways men and women are treated were discernible, the way new patterns appear on flower petals under ultraviolet light.
Amazing. Thank you. Maybe actually before we start, I should just mention how we know each other.
Yeah, please.
Which is that I came across your article from, was that 2015?
I think
I think
2017.
17. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
About bias, and I ended up quoting it in my book, which is largely about attention. And that's a large part of what I love so much about this book, is it is, in a way, a lot about attention, but paying attention to your attention in a way. So I really appreciate it for that reason and so many other reasons. But maybe we could just start with hearing about just kind of like the backstory of how you came to write this book, and just maybe where it started.
Yeah, absolutely. I had been, let's see, I started writing about bias, I think in 2006, a long time ago. I mean, I think I wrote my first article that looked at gender bias in particular, and it was really prompted by my own experience of pitching, which is a story I tell in the book, which is that when I was a young freelance journalist in Minneapolis trying to kind of like break into national magazines, um, I was pitching cold and I didn't know any editors, and I was just sort of sending queries out into the ether, and I wasn't having success. And then in a moment of desperation, I pitched under a name that I thought might be seen as a man's name. I used JD instead of Jessica. And like the pitch was accepted immediately, like within hours. And so that, I think it was shortly after that that I started really writing stories about gender bias to begin with. And then like over the years kept just like the topic was endlessly interesting to me and endlessly relevant and constantly relevant. So I wrote sort of like at an with increasing momentum articles about bias. And then I wrote a couple in, I think it was like 2014, 2015, that started to it seemed like people like really had an appetite for the topic, were really interested, and started those articles got a lot of attention. And I remember one day, I think it was in 2015, saying to uh, the man I was living with, who's now my husband, I think there's a book length work here. I think there's so much more that I want to explore that can't fit into like a magazine piece, like what I've been writing. And that was sort of the moment that the idea crystallized, that this needed to become a longer project. And then it shifted from being about, my focus shifted from being on sort of documenting and exploring bias as a phenomenon, a pervasive phenomenon, to really like, what can we do about it? How do we move beyond, and where do we go once we've identified how serious it is?
Yeah, which is something that, I mean, I feel like I can't remember what my blurb was for the book, but I think there's like some of that in my blurb, which is just like the like your book is both realistic and optimistic, which I think is just so rare for this kind of topic. Like, it's really easy to talk about. Well, maybe it's not easy. You can talk about how horrible it is, but I think like the work that you did to also just like earnestly try to find examples of things that have worked or sort of paths forward, is just like so refreshing. Yeah.
Thank
So,
you. Thank you.
uh,
Yeah, I mean, it was
yeah.
yeah. And I think it made spending 6 years, almost 6 years on the project, um, more tolerable than it would if I had just spent 6 years thinking about
Okay.
how bad everything is.
Yeah, totally. So I mean, something that you and I have talked about is just like the research process. I mean, in different ways. You're a journalist. Your background is as a journalist. Mine is as an artist. But we've both been sort of like interlopers into different fields, maybe ways of researching. And so maybe like it would be nice to hear about just like the process of researching, also just because like it's so. I was going back through my copy today and just like all of the like post-its and things that I have in here. And it's just, there's so much, it's so dense. I mean, so that's like a whole other thing, is like how you're able to weave it together, but maybe just talk a little bit about just the research process.
Yeah, I feel like this was my first book, and so I didn't go in with like a preset idea of how I was going to research a book. It ended up being really organic, and it was kind of a combination of following, just like following honestly my kind of passionate responses to things. Like if I read a study and I felt really moved or shocked or just like excited about it, then I would kind of follow where it led me. And maybe it led me to those authors, like talking to the study authors, or looking at the citations, like going from that study to like other related studies. So in terms of like academic research, I feel like it was very kind of intuitive, like reading one thing and that would bring me to another. But I also sort of informally did a lot of research, just talking to a ton of people. I mean, um, during the period that I was writing the book, anywhere I went, like somehow the topic would have inevitably come up. I mean, probably because I was like bringing up the topic. But I was like, how are we talking about my book? I have no idea. Oh, um, but but yeah. So I mean, I found a lot of inspiration just talking to people about their questions and their interests, and that led me in directions. I mean, whenever I talked to a researcher, I would ask them, who else should I talk to? Like, who do you think is doing really
Mhm.
interesting work in this area? Especially maybe who are some people who we might not know very much about. Maybe they're not, their work isn't well known. And then it was just, yeah, following my own interests. I got really interested in like Assyriology and Egyptology and Nubiology, and just called up a whole bunch of like archaeologists to talk to them about the origins of patriarchy and the origins of racism. And yeah, sort of I guess my process was guided by an openness to all kinds of inputs and people.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like the best way to go about it. I mean, it's funny because I feel like there's this idea that maybe even just with nonfiction, that like research is supposed to be sort of organized and systematic or something, when it's like really not. At least in my experience, you are like kind of following an intuitive line, and it is so much about conversations, like the book is a sort of record of conversations with other people and with yourself, and it's a dynamic thing. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it really is. And I don't know if you experienced this when you were writing How to Do Nothing, but there was inevitably like a moment where I had all of this material and all of these notes from, interviews and all of these notes from, studies. And I was like, how, where's the through? How is this going to
Yeah.
make sense? It was, and there's always like a moment of just like complete like despair. Like there's no way I'm going to be able to find, a clear line through this. But then it always somehow appeared at some point. Sometimes, when
Yeah.
taking a shower or something.
Right. I mean, do you have an example? I mean, I've read it, but an example of one of those through lines, or just a sort of, or like also what we were talking about earlier, like just getting the lay of the land too, as you're like researching like these larger themes that become visible.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I mean, I think that one sort of structural through line that started to appear to me was that it was like one way I was able to organize things was by like telling a story that was like extremely interesting to me to tell, and had been interesting to learn and to talk to people about it. And then somehow like as I got to some moment where the story felt like there was like enough there that we needed to start unpacking it, then I would like shift to sort of backing up and looking into trying to
Mm-hmm.
understand how to make sense of that story using like research and scholarship,
Right.
and then sort of like moving back into the story. But I remember like for chapter 2, for instance, which is about mostly about children's development of prejudice, and it really focused on I focus on this one researcher named Becky Bigler, who's kind of controversial because she researches on children, um, which, she runs afoul of like ethics committees sometimes because she's looking at how children develop prejudice. And that one was really hard. But yeah, I mean, I remember at one point having just like a grid of like 10 by 10 post-its with like, paragraph by paragraph and sort of like moving them around, trying to figure out how it would all
I
come
know the
together.
post-its. That's
Yeah.
real. Yeah. And then it's so interesting because it's like, I mean, for me as a reader, it's like that's not like any sort of struggle around that is like not even evident at all. Like it just like reads very naturally, and um it's very it has that balance between like the intuitive and the sort of like human level of like storytelling, and then just like tons of data. But the data is not just like, here's some data, it's like arranged into something that's like comprehensible and emotional too. Like there's like an emotional valence to it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I really tried to I'm not shy, I feel like, about in communicating like my enthusiasm for the research. Like I only included studies that I was really excited about, that like I thought were incredibly interesting and like people needed to know about them. But I think that
Yeah.
like that is what I don't know, it's like one of the just like magical pieces of creating anything, which is that like when you're in the middle of it, it seems impossible that like the structure will emerge, and then once you've created it, it seems completely inevitable that that's the structure that it would have. And then yeah, like you
Yeah.
said, like it seems like why was that ever hard? Like it's
Yeah.
obvious, but like when you're trying to figure it out, it's painful and discouraging and confusing.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, it's just like if it were easy, then there wouldn't need to be a book about it, right? It's like you are trying to think through something that in a way that is arduous in a way, even if what you arrive at feels like a very like elegant and sort of like, intuitive argument. So yeah, I have to ask, like, I'm sure you probably don't have like a favorite study that's in the book, but is there like an example of one that you were really excited about?
um There are so many. It's, like, really hard for me to
Yeah.
choose a favorite study. I mean, there were some and they were, sort of different categories of studies. There were some that were just, like, so appalling, that were so
Yeah.
shocking. Um,
Right.
Studies about, like, health the bias in healthcare. I mean, they're just, like, such extreme examples of, I don't know if you remember the study that showed that uh, women with more like feminine characteristics received worse treatment in like a heart. I think I don't remember if it was. I'll have to look and get the specifics, but I think it was in cardiac treatment. There was a study that like looked at like symptoms and diagnosis and treatment and like time to treatment, and then also they did these surveys where they kind of like assessed how like stereotypically feminine the patients were, and they found that like the more stereotypically feminine, like the worse treatment they got. I mean, that was one that really stood out to me. um there was like a study about that showed that like Black patients with vascular disease are, compared to white patients, more likely to have a limb amputated as compared to limb sparing treatment. Even when like you control for hospital quality, insurance status, disease severity, all of these like potentially mitigating factors. So, I mean, some of the studies are just like eye opening and horrifying. Um, and there was, yeah, I mean, I was really moved by a lot of the studies on mindfulness and meditation, particularly on like the impact of loving kindness meditation on interpersonal reactions, thoughts, and behaviors. Um, there's a study that showed that like loving kindness meditators actually, over one part of the brain, they show more similar reactions in their response to images of the self and images of the other than people who don't meditate. So there's almost the sense that like the process of loving kindness meditation might start to dissolve some of the hard boundaries between self and other. I found that really interesting. I mean, I'm curious,
Yeah.
like as someone who's read like the whole book, were there any that stood out to you that you
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, this last quarter was my last quarter at Stanford, but I had taught for 7 years. So the ones that were about classrooms, I mean, yeah, there is that question about experiments on children, but like, there's just the one that was about this county in Florida with that involved like testing. I think like that one was really compelling to me because that's just like the realm that I was inhabiting, right? Like I was and grew up in, right? Like a really competitive test-based environment that is not like acknowledging any of the other circumstances around those tests. And then also thinking about like, when I was at Stanford, I would hear from students who were, from underprivileged backgrounds. They're sort of, on the one hand, they're happy to be there, but they also show up and they're like, they don't get any support and they're totally alienated, and they're like still at a huge disadvantage. So I think like any sort of like classroom or like student studies really stood out to me. But maybe you could describe that one, because I'm talking about it like,
Yeah,
but
So I think the one that you're talking about is there was a program in Broward County that found, this was I can't remember what year, this particular employee of the Broward County school system found that the like gifted and talented classes were basically dominated by white students and wealthy students, and the Broward County school system was not that way at all. And what she discovered was that what was happening, or what she hypothesized was happening, was that um, wealthy and white students were getting screened for gifted classes at a higher rate than non-white and less wealthy students. And so they instituted a universal screening program, because I think before that you had to be like a teacher or a parent would like recommend a student to be screened. And so they instituted universal screening, and it tripled the number of students who were either underrepresented minorities or English language learners or low income. And so it turned out that those students had just like, no one had thought to, like, they were just completely overlooked. Like no one had thought to screen them. And meanwhile, like the wealthier, whiter students they found been like overrepresented in part because parents had hired psychologists to give them like private tests, and these private tests would reveal like gifted scores at a really high rate.
What a coincidence.
Yeah.
And I mean, the other part of that that I remember is like, didn't it sort of go backwards then after that? Like that program was like discontinued, and then the disparity just like showed up again. So I feel like it's like this, illustration of like the fragility of those kinds of structures and programs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I mean, that was, I feel like, a big, just like something that became more and more apparent to me over the course of researching the book was like there are all these interventions. And, the book, like, I go into a lot of detail about all of these interventions that have like incredible like effects. They really have quite meaningful outcomes, but they're only as robust as like the infrastructure, whether it's like motivational infrastructure or like financial infrastructure. They're only like as strong as the kind of like the foundation that they rest on. And if the people who are in charge of, like in that case it was the budget, like
Mhm.
the budget diminished, and so they didn't have the money to do universal screening for a period of time. Yeah, so they are really fragile, and um yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So since we have been talking about like the studies and the research, I also just want to maybe just like point out to the audience, potential readers, that like this is, I find, a very poetic book. And I wanted to ask about you. You have a background in, or educational background in poetry, but also physics, right? And I think that that's actually a really interesting lens through which to read this book, because there's so many extremely helpful but also beautiful metaphors. But then the metaphors themselves are often like spatial or structural. So like you really get the sense of like something that's really, I think, hard to articulate, and I'm really grappling with in the book that I'm currently writing, which is like the individual versus the structure. Like that's always been difficult to conceive of, even just for a person thinking about yourself. Like, how am I complicit and caught up in these systems and like reproducing these effects at the same time that like this structure exists outside of me? And so like I just wanted to mention a few that as I was flipping through this morning, that I really love, which is, one is that you compare, so you write, without refashioning these constraining structures, policies, laws, algorithms, relying on individuals is like running up a down escalator, which that's very useful. And then you also write that seeing the emergency of patriarchy as an evolving reality rather than a timeless fact was an illumination, a lightning flash disclosing an entire landscape. Lies repeated often enough do not become truth, they become invisible. So there's like that sort of like the language of like seeing something that was there all along, like that kind of, that metaphor. So anyway, I was just wondering if that's something you felt as you were writing it, that you were drawing on those things.
I think, that's such an interesting question and observation. So my undergraduate degree is in physics, and then I studied poetry as a graduate student. And I think both of those ways of seeing the world are so kind of entrenched in my mind that I don't consciously think like, now I'm going to create a physics metaphor, or now I'm going to create, like
Yeah.
a simile, or like synecdoche, or, some kind of enjambment or something. Um, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I think in this, in this case, one of the challenges of writing was that it's so abstract, like the concept of bias. I mean, I remember we even had a lot of trouble figuring out exactly what we were going to call the book, because we wanted something kind of concrete, but it was hard to find something really concrete to use as a title. Um, and the concept is really slippery. You're talking about the mind and what's happening in the mind, and so yeah, I mean, I think whenever I had an idea that I could compare it to something visual or something spatial or something like temporal, something that like had some kind of sensory dimension, I sort of went for it, because I felt like I love metaphors for one thing, and also I just felt like it was essential to kind of keep grounding these abstract ideas in something that felt a little bit more um immediate, like the light, like and also, I mean, just genuine. Like I really did feel when I when I really sank into um the the kind of the foundational reality that is like patriarchy in our society. It really did feel like a lightning flash. Like um suddenly it felt like I could see the way it influenced, you know, the world around me in 360 degrees in a way that had been a little bit obscured before.
Yeah. I mean, that's the experience that I had also, just sort of reading the book. It's like, largely thanks to those like very graspable metaphors. It's like, I mean, that's what I think a lot about metaphor and analogy, and how it's an act of translation. Like take like speaking something in a language that like someone can understand, and like that's what allows someone to really take something and like internalize it. And so I mean, I mentioned it to you in an email, but like after I read this book, like things were kind of starting to open up at the time, in Oakland, and I was on the bus again and like around strangers again, and it was this really surreal experience of like I could see things happening in my mind like as they were happening. Like I couldn't stop them from happening necessarily, but but I could see them, and it's like, and it was like deeply horrifying and stabilizing, but also like, I don't want to use the word liberating. It was like, but it's like if you can see something, then it means that you can maneuver around it, or you can pick it up, or like you can do something with it, right? Like, but whereas before it was just invisible to you. And so like it gives you more options in terms of like how to act. And I think like, and then, but you also write with such compassion that it's like, I can sit and like see that, and also not just like dissolve completely into like self-hate and shame. You know what I mean? Like, cause that's like not really productive either. Um, so, so I mean, I assume like you had some of that experience for yourself too, of just getting, I mean, you sort of just described it, right? It's like of of having the sort of ground like shift under you. But I
Yeah.
mean, it took you years to write this book. So those shifts must have been pretty big.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I really feel like I started writing the book with the sense that maybe most of us have, which is like bias is definitely a problem, but I'm probably a little bit less biased than everybody else. Like everybody else is probably a little bit more biased than I
Yeah.
am. And, I had experienced so much in the way of um I had had so many experiences of like gender bias in the workplace and in other aspects of life that I think I went into the project with kind of like righteous anger, and was immediately confronted with like the humbling reality of my own biases and the ways that I expressed them in unintentional and really unexamined ways. And so the righteous anger really evolved into like humble urgency.
That's a good way to put
or
it.
urgent humility, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, it was there's nowhere to hide really. Well, once you sort of see what's going on in your own mind, and particularly if you see it because someone else points it out to you, which happened to me like several times over the course of writing the book, then um yeah, I mean, there's nowhere to hide. Like, but like as you say, I mean, there's something liberating about that too. Once you see what's happening, then I think as you were saying when we were talking earlier, um, that's the first step into agency, into like free will, like being able to actually make a thoughtful um and reasoned decision about how you want to be in the world instead of kind of
Right.
blindly reacting, which I hadn't realized, the extent to which I'd been doing that before.
Right, right. And I think a really important part of that, and because I'm writing this book about time, I was very attentive to time related things in your book. Like, one of the things that I remember underlining was like the role of like time pressure on bias, like people who are under stress or like, you know, don't have time or you're rushed, right? Like
Mhm.
you maybe like fall back on these like a shorthand, which is like bias is sort of like a shorthand, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Anytime you're sort of under any kind of like really intense cognitive load, whether it's like time pressure or just exhaustion, fatigue, like emotional stress, any of those things that create kind of like pressure and load on the mind, definitely make us more susceptible to
yeah,
bias. So if there weren't
right.
enough reasons to cultivate like a calm calm self, that's like yet another reason, because it really makes it much easier to manage those patterns.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also like, you know, it's attention, as I learned, like writing How to Do Nothing, like attention requires time and yeah, some amount of like time and openness. And I think, you know, I just think, you know, when you hear about something like bias, it's like maybe someone thinks about it only sort of in negative terms, like, oh, that's something I need to like not do, but it doesn't highlight the potential like gains of not being biased, which is that like the world is much more alive to you. And that like the world has people in it. Like, and
Yes.
it's a much less lonely place.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and you're interacting with reality instead of like a hallucination, which
Yeah.
I think we often are. We're interacting with hallucinations or daydreams of other people and not people. And actually, that's one of the things that um like toward the end of the book, I I was really interested in exploring, and if I was able to keep writing the book, I think I would have like really really gone deeply into um the way that our own biases harm, harm the self, and what we really have to gain by having this more kind of life affirming and genuine relationship with the world.
Right. Which I mean, to kind of to go back to that study you were mentioning about meditation, like on the one hand, you could say that that sounds like, oh, you know, you're doing it for yourself, but like that yourself, that doesn't really have the same meaning if you've sort of dismantled these boundaries between the self and other, then it's just for whatever you want to call that nexus, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
That edge. I mean, kind of like the fertile kind of generative place where two people come together.
yeah,
Um
right. Which I think is, I mean, that would make sense. Maybe you should write another book about that. I don't know, selfishly, because I mean, that's something that I just feel like it's so, I mean, you and I talked about this, but like it's so hard for us to conceive of like a network or these like edges and meeting places versus like individuals who have bias or like who have characteristics and or as if they could sort of contain them.
mhm,
Like that's just still, even like you know, I'm trying to write against that, I still have that, like I can like feel the effort, you know.
mhm, mhm.
And so like, and you've probably had to deal with that too, just given the structure and the individual kind of debate that's like playing out
Mhm,
in the topic.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like, and it was I think because of like the inheritance of this culture and just the frameworks that we have to think within. Um, it was in some ways hard for me to even really like completely understand what like the psychologist Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela means when she talks about, um, I am human through my ability to bestow humanity on you. Like the idea of interdependence that in other cultures, she's South African, like in that culture, the idea of human interdependence is something that she can draw on in her thinking and her understanding of like how we should be in the world. But it's so divorced from like how we are that it's hard. I think it's like an act of imagination for us to even try to really understand what that means. What does it mean to be human through each other, which
Yeah.
is kind of where I was trying to get to toward the end.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, maybe that's related to this question of what your hopes are for the book in the world, what you want people to get from it. I shouldn't phrase it like that, get from it. Like, you know what I mean? Like what kind of reaction, you know?
Yeah, I mean, mainly I'm just like, I'm really excited to hear people's reactions. Like, I love hearing what you got out of it and how it connected to, what you were doing in your life at the time that you were reading it, and how it made it, how it affected the way you were sitting on the bus and looking at people. Um, I mean, I think my hope is for people to be able to enter into the book at whatever point in their own journey of whatever journey they're on, like wherever they're at, to be able to enter into the book um and move deeper into their own journey, like take what they can from the book and allow it to move them in whatever way that it does. And ultimately, I mean, my dream would be for the book to have a you know a positive, large, and meaningful impact on like the biased interactions and structures that we have in the world, and create like a more fair and like life-giving place for us to all live within. And I think I'd also like for people who work within organizations or who are part of communities, um, to be able to use some of the practical kind of tools and strategies and interventions as well in their own like immediate environments. But I don't know. I mean, um, I think like the book sort of occupies this weird limbo between like a practical sort of like book of like news you can use, and kind of more of a, honestly, like more of kind of like a spiritual, emotional like journey and invitation, and it doesn't really fit neatly into either one of those.
Yeah, which I mean, I like that. I was about to say I'm biased that I like that, because no, I really do. I like books like that. Because I mean, I think a topic like this has to be, right, like, and there's so many, I mean, so many things, so many aspects of life, right now, like, I've been reading books about climate change, and it's like there's almost like a similar issue there, where it's like there's the hard science and the statistics, and they're deeply horrifying. And then like in the middle of that, there's like a human that's like horrified and, heartbroken. And it seems like you can't really have one without the other. It's like you need to address both. And I can't remember how you, at some point in the book, I think you addressed the reality also that like policies are made by people.
Mhm.
And so it's not like, I think sometimes, I don't know, maybe I'm speaking for myself, I feel so alienated from policy, like policy level stuff, that I forget that there's that like very important connection.
Mhm.
And so like even just thinking about solutions, like you do end up at that intersection of like what an individual person thinks and feels, and then what the structure is.
You really do. And honestly, I really had like a dark night of the soul, like a couple of years into writing the book. And because I just felt like the deeper I went into understanding sort of like the core root of the root of so many of these problems, the more I saw like structures that needed to be dismantled. And I remember like waking up at 1 a.m. one night and being like, how can I be writing so much about psychology and the individual and the cognitive dimension of this when these structures are so, in so much need of repair? And I really was like lying in bed, like, what am I doing? What am I doing? And then I remember like having this thought, like, we can burn structures down, but we can't burn ourselves down. Like, we are the ones who make these things. They're all made by people. And so like ultimately it leads back to the human heart. I really believe that. And like the human spirit. So I think the like individual versus structure question is a bit of a false dichotomy, a false dichotomy. And ultimately, yeah, I think that we need we need um to the movement of the human heart ultimately.
Yeah, right. Which is, I mean, I think that is one really lovely thing about books. It's like you're speaking directly to someone, in the space of, them privately reading this book, right? Like I think it really has the opportunity to speak in that way. So, I mean, it did to me. So,
Thank you
um,
so much.
yeah.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
So should we maybe go to Q&A at this point?
Oh, sure. Let's
Yes.
see if I can exit the full screen here.
Hi. All right.
I haven't
So
even
yeah.
comments, so let's
Yeah, we
see.
have a bunch of nice questions and comments. If you are still haven't written your question down yet, do it now. So we will see it in a few seconds here. I've got one here from a Natasha. I had a young female employee tell me that she hadn't believed that gender bias was real until she joined the workforce. Do you think that's a positive sign as to what's happening in schools?
That is that's so interesting.
Wow.
I mean, I would say I had a similar trajectory. I didn't disbelieve that gender bias was real, but I didn't really understand its dynamics, and I didn't understand the sort of consistent replicable patterns of gender bias that like women encounter in the workplace until I really, experienced the workplace. I think I was also sort of taken aback by sort of how like how obvious some of it was, and kind of indisputable. So the question is, do you think it's a positive sign as to what is happening in schools? Yeah, I think it is. I mean, if someone can make it K through 12 or K through whatever and like not, experience bias or not even believe it's real, yeah, I think that is a positive sign. And I think it also um it's tough. I mean, this is like it's a question, and I remember talking about it with Ben Barris, actually, the gentleman who I was reading about at the very beginning. And he became this huge advocate for women in science, but he really struggled with how much he even wanted to tell women about bias. He was like, "Am I setting them up for, am I pre-discouraging them by telling them about this reality?" And that was something that he really struggled with. It's a difficult tension to know what to do.
All right. I'm seeing if I can see any other questions yet. Um,
I
here's
just
just
have
a
to say
comment.
hi to
Oh,
everybody who's like saying hi. This is like so awesome. I see
yeah.
like people from all over the country. So cool.
Here's just a comment from B. Ellis, Southwest Colorado. As a woman who worked in a male-dominated industry for 30 years, I'm looking forward to reading Nordell's book, hoping others will too, and see how unconscious bias impacts equal pay. Thank you for that comment. Um, Here's a question. I'm going to let you take this in any direction you want. It's from Melissa. Can you share one tactic to help us every day? Just help us, Jessica.
um one tactic. Um I mean, I will share with you something that I have done that has helped me, which is um when opportunities to when opportunities arrive to move toward the unfamiliar, like take those opportunities. I think that one of our most strong biases is homophily, which means literally love of the same. And we can so easily um, find ourselves drawn toward sameness, whether it's, people that we feel we already, have a lot in common with, or situations that feel familiar. And I think keeping our eyes open to opportunities for something new, to learn something new, or to be around people who are, unfamiliar, or whatever it is, like seeking out and seizing those opportunities is I would say that's one tactic that can be really powerful. And also, I mean, yes, it also there are all sorts of there's like amazing research about the impact of creating meaningful connections across social differences, and like what how that actually breaks down prejudices. Um there's like really good research about that as well.
Cool. Thank you. Here's one from Richard. How do you think this book gets into the hands of people who need to read it, who may not be the people who want to read it? This is a great question for me, the bookseller, as well as just a general.
Well, I guess you could just like put it in their backpack when they're not paying attention. No, but I mean, I think it's a larger question, which is like the problem of like preaching to the choir. Like are the people who are already motivated the ones who are going to be reading this and putting these tactics into place? I mean, I think the way I would answer this question is that social norms are really powerful. So and there's research about this. Everything I'm saying, there's like research about it. Social norms are really powerful. So when we see the people around us behaving in a particular way, whether it's advocating for like more fair practices at work or advocating for a particular policy, the more we see that happening around us, the more that behavior is implanted in our mind as like the normal, typical, popular behavior, and it affects the way we behave. So I guess what I'd say to Richard Latchman, who is a dear friend of mine from Toronto, actually, what I'd say, Rich, is I think by setting an example, by setting a powerful example and recruiting other like-minded people to whatever behavior it is that you think is important to promote, by setting that example, you are affecting the people who maybe aren't necessarily going to pick up the book, because they're going to see it and it's going to start to kind of filter into their mind as a norm. And that's what we really need to do. We need to start developing new norms.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, here's something from Brad. Thank you for doing this work to research and write about this and raise awareness and encourage constructive conversation. What's the best everyday thing we can do to be aware of bias, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, the question is like, how do you become aware of what's happening in your own mind? And practice is really helpful. Mindfulness is really helpful. I think the same techniques that allow people to the same techniques that people use in mindfulness meditation are it's really the same thing. It's like starting to separate oneself from one's thoughts and see and be able to have kind of metacognitive experience about one's own thoughts. And it's really about practice. I mean, it's really a practice. I remember like my editor and I had this like long debate about what the subtitle of the book should be: the science and practice. I wanted to call it at one point science and spirit, and she was like, no, it's too spiritual. Science and story. And we settled on practice because of this just like reality that this is something that requires like kind of like a daily commitment, a practice, like a meditation practice, or like another, a religious practice, or like something that you sort of recommit yourself to regularly.
Yeah. Here's something more specific from Susan. The page you read reminded me of a transgender man who became a father and realized that mothers dominate the realm of parenthood. He now feels a bit lost in his parenting journey. Do you cover this in your book? And given that there are so many realms that men dominate, how do we better embrace fathers in parenting, or I guess in some realms that women traditionally dominate?
That's a really interesting question. I did not specifically cover the experience of men in like women dominated realms, whether it's parenting or other kinds of childcare or like elementary school teaching or nursing. I mean, that it's a really important question. Like, how do you support men in fields where they might not feel completely welcome, or where they might feel alienated? And I think it's the same. I think it's the same approach that we need to use for women in male dominated fields, which is creating like inclusive environments, creating inclusive practices. And yeah, I think it's essential. And I wish I'd been able to include it in the book, but I wasn't able to.
Yeah, great question, Susan. Just a good idea from B. Ellis. I'd suggest marketing this to HR departments and corporations that need to address biased cultures. Great idea. Natasha says, when you have found your own personal biases, how do you acknowledge them while allowing yourself the grace that you may give to others more easily? I think many of us beat ourselves up over our realizations of our bias.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question as well, and it's really important because that stage of recognition can give rise to a lot of shame and guilt and paralysis. And in fact, one of the social scientists who I interviewed works with a lot of companies doing sort of anti-racism trainings, and she said she found that she what she noticed so often was that when white people would like make a mistake, it would trigger so much shame and guilt and kind of uh like emotional dysfunction that they would just completely disengage from the process. And so she said, actually, like the single most important thing to do is to be able to persist after a misstep, because you're inevitably going to misstep when you're trying something new and when you're like, venturing into this unfamiliar realm. So I would say, um, I mean, the practice of self compassion is like a whole practice that I think is really important. One thing that can be helpful to keep in mind is just how old these toxic lies are, and how, you know, racism is hundreds and hundreds of years old. Sexism is thousands of years old. It predates the written record, like the patriarchy predates the written record. So we've inherited all of this stuff. I mean, I think we can give ourselves a little bit of grace in realizing like we didn't start the fire. We've inherited these things over hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. But that also doesn't like excuse us from the responsibility of figuring out new ways. And I think but I think it really is important to hold that those things in balance, like grace and compassion for the self, but also um like commitment and urgency to create a better path going forward.
Well, I think that is the last question I see over here. Jenny, do you have a final question or thought you want to leave Jessica with here?
I guess maybe just, given that last question, I would say, I mean, I'm just thinking about time all the time right now because my book is about time. I think like maybe one way to have self-compassion, and also one reason I love this book and the way that I sort of took it was like in time. Like we all exist in time. We all exist between the present in which there's just like crushing injustice, and then some sort of imagined future in which there isn't, and then there's like the space in between, and like we're in that space and it's really uncomfortable. And so I think just like, especially in this age of like quick fixes, short attention span, instant gratification, just like thinking about everything as just a work in progress. Like you're a work in progress. These systems are, they're persisting through time, and it takes time and patience to undo them. So I think like just remembering that there is like a temporal dimension, like that's been helpful for me. And that's like, I view this book as being something in a journey, that like something that has been helpful in a movement that is going to continue, for the rest of my life, instead of like this book, one weird trick, to end all bias. Yeah.
Yeah, and that like actually recognizing your biases is it's an amazing step on the journey, because before you recognize them, you were in, an illusion, and now you're not in an illusion. So that is you've already progressed on your temporal journey, and that's exciting.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much to the both of you. As a reminder, the phone number for Majors and Quinn, which is the bookstore where there are signed copies of The End of Bias at Beginning, is up further in the chat. It is 612-822-4611, and we are open until 10 p.m. Central Time every night. So there's no reason not to just give us a quick call as soon as we hit end broadcast. we're going to be there. Thank you so much, Jessica and Jenny. This was such a wonderful conversation. And thank you, everyone, for your great questions and comments. It was lovely to have you here. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you
rest of
both.
the day.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank
and
you so
thanks,
much.
Annie. Really appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. It was
Yeah.
really awesome to see all your comments and greetings.
Yeah. All right.
Bye.
Have a good night. Bye.